Will officially start. This is going to be a really special edition of our author series. I think many of you, not I think, but I know that you know who this author is, William Kent Krueger, who is, just a prolific writer and best-selling author for many, many years. But I want to officially welcome everyone to the 33rd edition of the author series on behalf of the Women's Association of Hilton Head Island. My name is Robin Zimmerman, and I have enjoyed working with the team, Janet Porter and Bobby Helbig and Nancy Fish, all these years. Before COVID, we started, and it just continues to be just a great opportunity for our members to learn about not only kind of the plot of a book, but really the inner workings of how an author writes and what that creative process is. So you are in for a treat. That actually the book that we're going to focus on today, although Janet is going to talk about Kent Krueger's background and some of his other books and his famous series, but the book that we're going to concentrate on today, let me just make sure you can see it with my light, The River We Remember by William Kent Krueger. He's actually up in Minnesota, in St. Paul. We just talked with him a few minutes ago, so it's going to be a delight. I just want to remind you that this is a webinar, which means you can see us, but we can't see you. Use the Q&A button so that if you have any questions for Kent or for Janet while the interview is taking place, we go to about 5:40, but you'll have that opportunity to participate. And so with that, I'd like to bring in Janet Porter, my colleague, who looks beautiful as ever. And she said, I have been waiting and waiting and waiting for this author. And he just sounds so delightful, Janet, in our little pre-interview a few minutes ago. So with that, I just want to remind our ladies, as we move forward, Bobby's always looking for outstanding authors to feature on our author series. So if you have any recommendations or any thoughts, please just send them our way. You can email either Bobby or Janet or myself. And we've gone every other month, right, Janet, instead of every month. So our next featured author will be in January, and I'll be back to talk a little bit about that. Also, I'll be talking about the December the 7th signature event. So with that, I'm going to sign off, and I'm going to turn it over to Janet for our interview with William Kent Krueger.
So first of all, for those of you who haven't joined us before, welcome. This is a webinar. It's not a meeting Zoom. So that means we can't see you, but we can hear you if you go onto the toolbar and look for something that says question and answer, Q&A. And if you post a question there, I'll be able to ask the participants. I'll be able to ask Kent the question. I got distracted by trying to see some of the Q&A comments already. I'm thrilled today to interview William Kent Krueger for you. And before I introduce him, I just want to acknowledge Bobby Helbig, who's co-chair. Bobby and I talk about authors all the time, and she does all the legwork to get the authors booked. But my dream interview was William Kent Krueger, and she knew that. And she persisted and persisted. And we knew he had a book coming out. He's just come off book tour. And I'll tell you a little bit about him and then a little bit about his books. But Bobby, thank you for making it possible for me to interview my dream author. My dream author would be Lee Harper, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, but she's not with us anymore. So this is number two. So Kent was born in Oregon. He attended Stanford. And before he was kicked out for his radical activities, which you could ask more questions about that if you want. It was during the Vietnam War, so that gives you a hint. He ended up becoming a logger, a freelance journalist, a construction worker, a researcher at the University of Minnesota. And then he and his wife, who was from Nebraska, ended up moving to St. Paul, Minnesota, so that she could attend the University of Minnesota Law School. And he had always been a writer and had written, but now he really devoted himself full-time to writing eventually. He writes a mystery series that's set in the northwards of Minnesota in what's called the Iron Range, with a protagonist named Cork O'Connor, who was the former sheriff of Tamarack County and a man of mixed heritage, part Irish and part Ojibwe. His work has received, during COVID, I read the 18 books in that series back to back. I got introduced to this series of William Kent Krueger, and I'll tell you how that came about. And then I just read those books back to back. And so for the first 2 or 3 months of COVID, whenever I think of that, I think of Kent and what entertainment he brought to my life and solace. So he's won the Minnesota Book Award, the Anthony Award, the Berry Award, the Dillis Award, and the Friends of American Writers Prize. Ordinary Grace, he has 5 books that are not in the Cork O'Connor series. And one of them is called Ordinary Grace, and it's been a favorite of book groups. And that was a standalone novel published in 2013, and it received the Edgar Award and the Mystery Writers of America Award. A companion novel, which is also set in southern Minnesota, This Tender Land, was published in September of 2019 and spent literally 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list. His last 11 books have been on the New York Times bestseller list, which is an accomplishment most writers would die for. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to Kent. Kent, please join us.
Hello, Janet. Hello, everybody.
So I'm an author groupie, and I'm a lot of people just read books and aren't interested in meeting the author, but I'm an author groupie. And so meeting you kind of is like meeting Paul McCartney would be to a, musical groupie.
To me.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm thrilled you joined us today. So tell us where you are right now.
I am in the basement of my home in St. Paul, Minnesota.
And you just came off book tour.
I did. I was on book tour for about 10 weeks or so, all the way across the country. Had a lot of fun and exhausted myself.
Oh my gosh. I thought you were going to say 10 days, 10 weeks.
Yeah, I did. I had scheduled approximately 50 signings across the country in those 10 weeks.
Isn't that a longer book tour than most authors would do?
I have no idea what most authors do. All I know is it was what I wanted to do for this particular novel.
Have you ever done one this long before?
In the old days, most of my book tours were anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks.
Were they?
And I structured them myself. I set them up myself. My publisher underwrites them, but I know all the booksellers now, and so I typically do all the logistics myself.
Wow. So Ken, one of the reasons that I'm so pleased to introduce you to our members, to the WAHI members, is because your books are so focused on family, and that sense of family and those connections. And your father, you've noted, was an English teacher. So could you start by talking about how he influenced you to become a writer?
Sure. My father in particular was so significant in my desire to become a storyteller. For this reason, when myself and my siblings went down to bed at night when we were kids, my father always read to us. Sometimes he read stories, but more typically it was one of the great story poems. He wasn't just an English teacher. He was the head of the drama department and the speech department. And so my dad, when he read poetry, he just put his heart into those great story poems. So I grew up on The Highwayman and Little Orphan Annie and The Raggedy Man and The Charge of the Light Brigade. These great story poems. And so I learned from my dad very early the power of language. The idea that words can move people if you use them correctly, can move people in really mysterious ways. So for whatever reason, I always wanted to be one of the storytellers. I have always written. I can't remember a time, Janet, when I wasn't writing.
And so how early do you remember, do you remember when you wrote your first story? How old were you?
Did you feed that line to me purposefully because you know the answer to this?
I don't know the answer.
Okay, because this is a story I often tell audiences. The first story I remember writing was a short story called The Walking Dictionary. Now, I just told you my father was a high school English teacher. And when I was a kid, he was always storming around the house ranting something like, "Nobody uses dictionaries enough. Nobody uses dictionaries enough." So in the 3rd grade, I wrote a short story called The Walking Dictionary, which was in fact about a dictionary that didn't think it was being used enough. It magically sprouted legs so that it could toddle off into the world and go to the people that needed it. My 3rd grade teacher, Janet, went gaga over that story. My folks oohed and awed over that story. I swear to you, in the 3rd grade, I knew I was destined to be a writer.
Well, it's so interesting because I often ask people in interviews for jobs, what's your earliest memory of really getting praised for something? Oh, you're so dramatic, or you're so generous and kind, because that affirmation we get as children reinforces what we're probably naturally good at, and it's iterative. The more you write, then the more you get praise, and then that's how you end up becoming. So
Well, in my
um,
case, it was often, Kent, you're such a big fat liar, because I was always telling stories.
well, and we're grateful you did. Then your father, I know, realized it was tough to support a family, being an English teacher
Yeah.
and drama coach. And so he took a job with Standard Oil, and your family became gypsies, moving 14 times around the United States. Although seen you in other interviews where you're quoted as saying you can't remember how many times you moved, actually. And every time you rethink it, that you get a
The
different
number
number.
changes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
just lived everywhere, basically.
and how did that talk about how that influences your writing?
Well, if you were to read This Tender Land, which is the story of four vagabonds, four children, on an epic journey in the summer of 1932, deep in the Great Depression, one of the themes of that story, the main the narrator, the main kid character, kid named Odie O'Banion, is looking for home. That's what he wants, and I have felt that most of my life until I found Minnesota. As soon as I moved to Minnesota, I knew I'd found home. So it has often that wandering sense, that rootlessness, that search for something we don't have, is very often a part of the story that I create. In writing a story like This Tender Land, I relied on my own awareness of what it takes to quickly make an impact on a community. So Odie O'Banion knows how to connect with people very well, uses his storytelling ability, his musical skills, everything. And he is very quickly accepted into the places where the vagabonds spend time in that particular summer. So it has played an important part in my work. Yeah.
Well, I moved around a lot as a child, and I think not as many times as you. You beat me by a mile, um, but I think it makes you a student of studying people and how to fit in and how people are different. And that must have influenced you when you went to Stanford and decided to major in cultural anthropology.
Yeah, I didn't actually major in cultural anthropology at Stanford. I was still trying to figure out what the hell I really wanted to do, and it was in the next couple of years. I never graduated from college because I finally decided that college wasn't teaching me what I needed to know in order to be a writer. But for the last couple of years I was in college, I was a essentially a cultural anthropology major, yeah, which has played a very important part in the research and the writing that I do for my Cork O'Connor series.
Yeah. So let's talk. We're going to talk quickly about your Cork O'Connor series, and then we'll get to the River We Remember. So you moved to Minnesota. You vacation in the Northwoods with your wife, like everybody does in Minnesota. Everybody goes to the
Yep.
Northwoods. To and you get fascinated with the culture there. So talk about that.
Yeah, as soon as or very shortly after we moved to Minnesota, as you point out, we began doing in the summer what everybody in the Twin Cities does in the summer. We go up to the beautiful lake country of northern Minnesota. We began spending a portion of every summer at a YMCA camp, very close to the Canadian border, a place called Camp du Nord, that is literally across the road from the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is one of the most gorgeous pieces of a geography you're ever going to find on this earth. And I fell absolutely in love with the North Country. And so I knew that when I got serious about my work, I was going to set my stories up north. When I took a really good look at the North Country, I realized you can't tell a true story set in northern Minnesota without including the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, as an element of your work, because their influence in the North Country is ubiquitous. It's everywhere and it's powerful. So I decided I was going to incorporate the Ojibwe in whatever way I could in terms of my work. What did I know about the Ojibwe at that point in time? About what every white person knows about the Native people we live shoulder to shoulder with: nothing. But as you point out, I was a cultural anthropology major in college. And so the idea of learning about the Ojibwe was exciting. And of course, I began the way all good academics begin. I began by reading. Then in the course of my research, I began to meet members of the Ojibwe community and form relationships that across all of these years have become important friendships. I do rely on my Ojibwe friends for their perceptions, their suggestions. So many of the stories in the Corcocana series have come from issues that my friends in the Native community have enlightened me about, and that I have tried my best to make what is typically a white reading public more aware of. Whenever I finish a manuscript, I just finished a manuscript in the Corcocana series. It's called Spirit Crossing, should be out this time next year, folks. Whenever I finish a manuscript, I will typically give it to one, but usually two of my Ojibwe friends to read and vet for me. So I haven't said anything that's too stupid or even worse, offensive.
So you have this wonderful series that's very successful, and which I was hunkered down in bed reading cover to cover. I started with the first one and read them in order, which is what I recommend to people.
Yeah.
I don't know, everybody wants to read 18 of your books, but they evolve. So, and the characters evolve, and Cork's family evolves. Of course, we won't give away all of that, but so you're writing those, but then you do a departure and you write this Tender Land. Or did you write Ordinary Grace first?
It was Ordinary Grace. That was
Ordinary
my first.
Grace. So talk about making that shift.
Yeah, it wasn't a difficult shift for me at all, because Ordinary Grace was a story that I've been thinking about for a very long time. And finally, it came together in my thinking in a way that I figured I knew how to write this story. It was a much more difficult thing for my publisher to accept. When I proposed the project to A2A Books, Simon & Schuster, they were not excited at all. They kind of called me out to New York City and sat me down and said, "Kent, we really only want Corcocana novels from you." So I knew if I wrote the story, it was going to be a risky proposition, but it spoke to me in such a compelling way that I knew I had to write it. And across the course of the next 3 years, without a contract, I composed the manuscript for Ordinary Grace. There are two reasons I wrote Ordinary Grace. For me, it represents a place where two important journeys in my life have come together in a really meaningful way. My journey as a writer and my spiritual journey. As I told you earlier, I've always been on a writer's journey. I knew that. Spiritual journey has been a little more difficult for me. I think we're all on a spiritual journey, whether you embrace that or not. And so it has that consideration, that concern, has found its way into so many of my stories. If you were to read the Corcocana novels, you would see the spiritual journey as an undercurrent in so many of those stories. It's something that comes really naturally for Corcocana because he's a man of mixed heritage, and he comes from two different spiritual traditions: white Catholicism, he's Irish Catholic, and his Ojibwe spirituality. So he's very often in the stories trying to figure out the divine, the creator, and where his spiritual path lies in that regard. And I had been looking then for a while for a story that would allow me to explore more deeply the importance of the spiritual journey, and Ordinary Grace offered me that opportunity. But there was another reason I wrote Ordinary Grace. I'd been looking for a while for a story that would allow me to go back and recall an important period in my own life, the summer I was 13 years old. I don't know what being 13 years old is like for the women who are watching, but really important time for guys. We're standing in that threshold to our manhood. We're, not quite ready to go forward yet. For a lot of reasons I won't go into at the moment. I have vividly remembered the summer I was 13 years old. And so I wanted to find a story that would allow me to go back and remember that time and evoke it in such a way that I could use my own perceptions, my own memories of the time to create the story. So for anybody who's read Ordinary Grace, the Drum family at the heart of it, that's my family. The town of New Bremen, where it's set, is so like the small Midwestern towns where I'd spent so much of my time growing up. And although my publisher hadn't been excited about the book, it ended up winning tons of awards when it came out. It's been translated in more than 24 foreign languages. So far, it's sold well over 1 million copies. So did all right for me.
Yes. Times best other bits for how many weeks? Weeks and weeks.
Well, Ordinary Grace didn't hit that big initially for a lot of reasons. But it has it has a huge following now. Word of mouth, really, Janet, is what propelled Ordinary Grace. It has become a favorite of book clubs all over the
It
place.
has.
I have spoken in churches all over the country about the novel. This Tender Land, the companion novel, was the one that spent 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yes. Well, and I'm in a number of book groups, but I read both of those books in book groups. They are both favorites of book groups around the country. And then that's what introduced me to you and the Cork O'Connor series, was those books. And actually, given how high the sales of both of those books have been, I would imagine that's not unusual for people to discover you then through This Tender Land or Ordinary Grace, and then move over to Cork O'Connor. Although I'm not sure everybody reads the whole series back to back like I did.
No, but I have had so many people who typically wouldn't have read a mystery say that they tried my series because they so loved This Tender Land or Ordinary Grace, and have told me how much they appreciate the stories that I write in that series. I always like hearing that. Who wouldn't?
Yeah. So let's talk about the River We Remember, which is your latest book, and the book you just came off the 10-week book tour about that. Why don't you give an overview of the River We Remember?
Sure. The River We Remember is set in the summer of 1958 in southern Minnesota in an area I call Black Earth County. It opens on Memorial Day, 1958, when the body of the county's leading citizen, a man named Jimmy Quinn, is found floating in the Alabaster River, which runs through the town, dead from a shotgun blast and nearly naked. Now, this really is a true mystery, because the question at the heart of the story is who killed Jimmy Quinn and why. But that's not really what the story is about. In the early 1940s, my father graduated from high school, enlisted in the military service, and marched off to fight in Europe in World War II. You know, he was just a kid. He was 18 years old. He came back several years later, a man deeply wounded in body and in spirit by what the war had done to him. I realize now that he was probably suffering from PTSD, but, you know, nobody talked about that back then. Or if they did, they called it shell shock or battle fatigue. And like all kids, I pestered my father for war stories. Did you kill any Germans, Dad? He absolutely refused to talk about the war. And he was very, very much like the fathers of my friends, guys who, like my dad, had fought in World War II or the Korean War. And all of these guys went away kids, you know, some of them not even shaving yet. And they came back men wounded by the horrors that they had seen and the horrors that they had been a part of. And all my life, I've wondered, how could anybody heal from that kind of wounding? And what about the people they left behind, the people who love them, their wives, their mothers, their fathers, their sisters, people who I'm sure were praying for them desperately while they were off fighting, and maybe when the end lost them on the battlefield? How did they heal? How did anybody find a way to heal? And that's really what The River We Remember is about.
All of those three books, the books we're talking about, This Tender Land, Ordinary Grace, and The River We Remember, are all set in southern Minnesota. So how do you decide, and they're all set in different decades. So talk about how you pick a decade and a location in southern Minnesota.
Well, most of my standalones, I have written one other standalone that we're not even going to talk about now because it was a very long time ago. And I think 3 people in the entire universe read it. But the 3 standalones that I think of as companion novels, Ordinary Grace, This Tender Land, and The River We Remember, all set in southern Minnesota, because southern Minnesota is has a very Midwestern vibe going on there. And I spent so much of my adolescence growing up in the Midwest that it calls to my heart in terms of a great setting for a story. I write profoundly out of a sense of place, and so it's really easy for me to write lovingly about the Midwest. So that's one reason that I set them in southern Minnesota. In terms of the era in which I decide to set a story, depends on the kind of story I'm going to write. I already explained Ordinary Grace. I wanted to talk about the time I was 13 years old, which was not quite in 1961, but I chose 1961 primarily because it was the first year that the Twins played as a major league ball team here in the Twin Cities. They were the Washington Senators before that. And so it was an easy signpost for me to use in terms of lots of people's thinking here. This Tender Land I set in the Great Depression because one of the things I wanted to talk about in that book is the question of who we are at heart as human beings, particularly during periods of great privation or when great stress is put on us as a culture, as a people. In these periods, are we the kind of people who retreat into ourselves and protect only that which is important to us? Or are we the kind of people who open our arms and despite how little we might have, we're willing to share it with those who have less? And I couldn't think of a better period of time to explore that question than the Great Depression. I set the River We Remember in 1958 because I wanted it to be in the post-war eras, post-World War II, post-Korea. And I wanted enough time to have passed for the men of that generation to now have sons, because one of the things I wanted to explore was the difficulty that men have trying to understand what it is moving from childhood into manhood. Where are the guideposts for that? And in post-World War II and Korea, so much of it revolved around the heroism that we heard about in those two wars. And so it seemed like a good period of time in which to set that particular story.
So were you inspired at all by just set anything in during COVID when we struggled like and it is a defining time in our history, like those times that you have selected in the past? Is that calling to you yet or not?
No, it's not historical enough for me yet. I think we are still trying to understand the full effect of COVID. I have had some colleagues who have ventured into that territory already and have done a very nice job of it. But at the moment, it doesn't speak to me.
Yeah, yeah. And the time has to speak to you, right?
Yeah, there has to be a voice of the story that speaks to me. Yeah, definitely.
So do you make a conscious effort to have a theme in your book, like forgiveness or relationship to the land or family? Well, those have all been themes in some of your books. Do you set out and the story pours out from you, and then you figure out this is really one of the themes that's come out because this is what I'm passionate about? Or are you thoughtful about that at the beginning?
Yes, yes and no. How I approach the writing of a story depends in large measure on the kind of story it's going to be. My Cork O'Connor stories are all mysteries, essentially. And the mystery is a very tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else. And I think the success of a mystery depends largely on the timing of the reveals. When do you give the reader the clues that are going to be necessary for solving the mystery at the heart of the story? So whenever I write a Cork O'Connor novel, I think that story through as completely as I can before I ever put my fingers to the keyboard. At the end of that thinking process, which can go on weeks or even months, I know how the story begins, I know how it ends, I know who did what to whom and why, I know the themes I want to read through the story. But my standalones are different. You know, a mystery comes from your head. It's an intellectual construct. It's a puzzle that you create in your mind. My standalones come from my heart. They don't come from my head. And so I have always looked for a process that would allow me to write a story in such a way that the reader will feel like I'm telling you this story straight from my heart. So going into the writing of Ordinary Grace, This Tender Land, and The River We Remember, I only knew a few salient elements of the stories I was going to tell, and I allowed the stories and characters to reveal themselves to me as we moved forward. Because the issues of our spiritual journey or families, the forces that seek to divide them, the forces that hold them together, how families are created, it's always been an important issue for me. Forgiveness, how do we come to a place of forgiveness, of forgiving ourselves and forgiving others? So it's really natural that somehow the story ends up carrying those themes along with it.
So I have an interesting writing routine, I think. My question is, are you still writing at the Java Cafe? And talk about how much going somewhere else to write has influenced you and how you got in that habit.
Well, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, for the vast majority of my career as a writer, I have done all my creative work in coffee shops. That that process began when my wife entered law school, and suddenly I became the sole support of the family. I was the guy who had to keep a roof overhead and food on the table, but I wanted desperately to be a writer. And so if I was going to meet my responsibilities and still develop as a writer, I had to come up with a way to do that. We were living a couple of blocks at that point from this iconic cafe in St. Paul, a place called the St. Clair Broiler that opened its doors at 6 o'clock every morning. So I pitched this idea to my wife. I said, Diane, if you're willing to get the kids up and fed and dressed and off to school, so I can go right first thing. I swear to you, when I come home at the end of the day from my job, I'll be the best husband, the best father you can possibly imagine. She bought it. So there I was every morning, 7 days a week at the St. Clair Broiler, waiting for them to open their doors at 6 with my pen and my notebook in hand. Pen and notebook because this was long before we had laptops. They would seat me in booth number 4, always booth number 4. They saved it for me. They would pour me my coffee. I would open my notebook, and from 6 till 7:15, I wrote. At 7:15, I closed my notebook, paid for my coffee, and went out front of the broiler, where at 7:20, a bus would pick me up and take me to the university. I wrote at the broiler for more than a quarter of a century. I composed probably 14 or 15 novels there. And you know, getting up every day, Janet, and writing helped me establish the discipline that I think is necessary to an artist, whatever your medium is. I think if you're going to accomplish anything as an artist, you have to approach your work in a disciplined way. But, you know, it did something even more important for me, and that I didn't realize until I looked back across all those years. When I looked back, this is what I realized. If I wrote first thing in the morning, I was feeding something in me that was essential to me, that needed to be fed, and that then in return gave me the energy I needed to go out and give to the world whatever I had to give to it, to keep a roof overhead and food on the table, because I'd already taken care of myself. Writing had become the way that I center myself in every day and create the energy to go out to the world and give it whatever I need to give it. And that's still a blessing that comes to me from my writing every day.
Yeah, I think people who have a passion like that, whether it's painting or writing or teaching or whatever, are that what a blessing that is to know what feeds your soul.
I couldn't agree more, Janet. I think I'm one of the most blessed people on earth because I have always known the journey I was on, at least in terms of writing.
Yes. And I know you help other writers. So I know you do some teaching. So tell us
Used to
about what
teach.
does that feed
I
your
haven't
soul?
I haven't taught for a very long time. Teaching, as my father taught me, requires a great deal of commitment and energy, and I simply haven't the time these days to commit to it. But for many years, I taught creative writing, particularly mystery writing. I taught for the extension here at the University of Minnesota, the University of Wisconsin, Ball State. I've taught at conferences all over the country, but I don't do that anymore.
Yeah, yeah. But still, think of all the people that you've mentored and who've gone on then to be able to feed their souls by having careers as writers. I mean, what a blessing that is.
Well, even if they don't have careers, here's what I used to tell my students, Janet, first day they walked into one of my classes. If you're here because you think it's going to be really cool to call yourself a writer, or you think you're going to get rich and famous at it, I can pretty much guarantee you'll be disappointed. But if you're here because writing is what you have to do, because it's what your heart tells you you have to do, then I can almost guarantee a different experience. And I think in the end, it's not going to matter whether you become rich and famous, because what you will have done is spent your life following your passion, following your heart. And what could be better than that? But I also told my students this: if you're true to that journey, eventually you're going to discover the writer you were always meant to be, and you'll be writing the stories you were always meant to write. And that's when the doors will open for you.
And do people, when people ask you for your advice about their writing, or when your students, what were their primary questions that they wanted you to help them sort out about their writing? Was it picking a theme, character development? You're so wonderful about giving a sense of place in your novels. So what do you think new writers struggle with the most?
The questions are all over the place, Janet. Different writers, different young aspiring writers, not always young, aspiring writers, are across a broad spectrum in age. And I always tell my students, you know, if you're starting late and you've got gray in your hair, it's never too late. It's never too late. When I didn't publish my first novel until I was 48 years old. And most of the writers I know lived fulfilling lives before they published and established a career as a writer. So so I have advised them in many ways. But the greatest piece of advice I try to give my students is you need to write every day for a variety of reasons. First of all, it helps you stay connected with the energy of your project. But it also is a signal to those around you who love you of the importance this is to you in your life. And it's a constant confirmation to you how important this is in your life. So I advise aspiring writers two things. First of all, write every single day. Doesn't matter how long you write in that day, but commit to writing every single day. And here's the other piece of advice I offer aspiring writers. Marry somebody with a good job.
Yeah, that's actually very helpful. So I want to ask.
Sure helped me. I'm married to an
Exactly.
attorney.
So I want to ask you a question from Sue Grosbeck, who's one of our WAHI members, and she says, "I've read all your books. In Catherine Haley's very positive review of the River We Remember, she describes your language as elegant, but she finds the asides jarring. She even questions whether you were encouraged to add them by your editors, as they are not evident in your other books. The structure of the book, with the beginning and end quote to Quinn, was praised, but she questions the interjections and feel they attempt the flow. What was your intention?"
You know, I have no idea what she's talking about.
In terms of so you didn't read that review, evidently.
You know, I typically don't read reviews. The asides, I'm not quite sure what she means by the asides in the
Okay,
story.
I actually didn't. I when I read the River Remember, I don't remember feeling that there were asides, so I wasn't sure what that was either.
So I'm a bit
but
confused. What can I say?
But talk about how much your editors shape your books. That's another. I mean, I think that's a general question from Sue: is how much do your books get shaped by the editors?
Very little, but in important ways. When I turn in a manuscript to my editor, it is as good as I can possibly make it, which doesn't mean it can't get better. And that's what a good editor does. They will leave what doesn't need to be worked on, and they will give you a good idea of where the book can be strengthened. I have the best editors, I think, in the business, and the suggestions that they have offered me have always been very well considered, uh, dead on, and generally speaking, very easy for me to incorporate when I am going about the revision process. So the story is mine, structure is mine, language is mine, the themes are mine, but some of the fine tuning is certainly in the hands of my editors, and I so trust their judgments.
So Carolyn McNitty, who's another one of our faithful members, says, "I've read Ordinary Grace at least 4 times, each time with renewed interest. Do you find this common for readers of your books, that they read the books repeatedly?"
Yeah, I do, as a matter of fact, and it pleases me no end. But I'm always a bit puzzled because there are so many fine novels out there. I'm glad to read my work, but you know, you should spend some time discovering the other fine writers who are out there.
Yeah. And Kim McCaskey says, "I'm on a Cork O'Connor reading journey." I consider it a binge reading, but she says, "I feel he is a man's man and a woman's man. Is Cork O'Connor a reflection of yourself, someone you know, or a combination?"
So I typically ask the question, and it's phrased this way: "Are you Cork O'Connor? Is Cork you?" I respond in this way: Cork O'Connor. O'Connor is an Irish name. Krueger is not Irish. Cork is Catholic. I am Methodist. Cork has significant Native heritage in him. I have none. Cork has a long history of law enforcement. I spent a night in jail once. So we're very different in many ways. But who Cork is, how he sees the world, his priorities certainly come out of who I am and how I see the world, and the things I believe, about why we are here in the first place. Cork's a family man. I'm a family man. He has children. I have children. So there are lots of ways in which we are similar and lots of ways in which we're very different.
Well, I think it is a gift that we've given our members who participated tonight, Kent, of introducing you to them. If for those who haven't, we obviously have some big fans who are attending tonight, but for other people who are being introduced to you, I think it's a gift we're giving them, because it's been you have so entertained me and fed my soul through your writing, and I really, really appreciate it. I'm so excited to have had the chance to meet you.
I love that phrase. You have fed my soul. I so appreciate that. Thank you, Janet. Thanks everyone for tuning in this evening.
Thank you, Ken. And now, Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you're going to talk a little bit about what are some of our upcoming events are.
Thank you, Janet. Wonderful job. That was just really inspiring. I don't know why my light is looking red. Do I look red, Janet? I guess I do.
You do look a little red. You look like you got a tan while we were interviewing. But I'll stop my video, and you can talk about our great upcoming December event.
Right, and this again is the book "The River We Remember" by William Kent Krueger. And that was an outstanding interview. As always, Janet does a super job. Our next author series will be on January the 11th. And Renee Rosen is our author. Fifth Avenue Glamour Girl is the name of her latest book. And we do want to just remind everyone about the December the 7th holiday luncheon. It will be at the Omni. We have Vera Stewart of the Very Vera Show. She's been on WSAV with her show for many years. She'll be there. She'll be talking about holiday entertaining and also her new cookbook she'll be signing. There'll be several vendors there. And I think the most important thing is during the holidays, you know, we always give to the Children's Center. And for those of you that don't know what the Children's Center does, it is a daycare and an early childhood learning center that serves hot meals and uses a sliding scale tuition schedule for the families. And it looks like, according to the team that leads Difference Makers, that we have 36 different neighborhoods this year that are involved with collecting the wrap toys for the full family. So it's not just the children, it's the siblings and the parents. So with that, if you have not signed up for December the 7th, we look forward to seeing all of you there. Again, we're at the Omni. I believe it starts at 10:30. So again, Janet, team, Bobby Helbig, and Nancy Fish, thank you for another great edition of the author series for the Women's Association of Hilton Head Island. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone, and we'll see you on January the 11th, if not before, or hopefully on December the 7th. Bye-bye, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving, too. Bye-bye.